I'm Alan Wardis, and you're listening to Think Radio.
I have known for years that on several old maps, the Gunnison River was called the Eagletail River, but we had no idea why it was called the Eagletail River.
That's from my conversation with historian Dave Primus and GIS expert Mike Pelletier. Together, they are using technology and good old-fashioned research to tell the story of the Gunnison Valley like never before. Stay tuned for more on this episode of Think Radio.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison's locally owned hometown newspaper, and by the Western State Colorado University Office of Academic Affairs. Think Radio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can become a Think Radio patron, visit alanwardesmedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
Dave, Mike, thanks for joining me today. It's awesome to see you guys again.
Thanks for asking us.
Yeah, great to be here.
You know, I've often described you guys as the map geeks because I've never seen anybody in my life more excited about a map than you two guys. Yeah. And so we're gonna find out why, right? That's what you're doing here. But I want to point out that you guys come from different directions. I mean, Mike, you work for Gunnison County. You're the GIS manager, director?
Correct. Manager, yeah.
And tell us what GIS stands for.
It stands for Geographic Information Systems.
Yeah, which sounds very,
Techy.
left brain.
Mm-hmm.
And Dave, you're a historian, among other things. But in this context, let's say you're a historian. How did you guys come together and realize, wait a minute, we're kind of talking about this same sort of things here?
I think we met at church, didn't we? We pretty much hit it off from the start. And I've loved Colorado history all my life, and I've also loved maps all my life. And I started to do things with maps and history at an early age. And
things like what?
Oh, things like when I was about 15, my grandfather owned a mine that was about 2,000 feet above I-70 at Georgetown, Colorado. And I started looking at old maps and doing historical research at the Denver Public Library and at the Colorado School of Mines to locate the section corners of the mining claims. And I found all these old field notes. And then at that time, I was looking at mining claim maps. And that was kind of the start, I guess.
And at what point did you realize, hey, this is pretty cool. I like this a lot?
By the time I was 15 years old.
Yeah. And what was it about it that really appealed?
I think, I've got kind of an analytical mind. And once I really understood that there was more than just a road map, that you could look at latitudes and longitudes in a very analytical way with a topographic map and see, the way the land was laid out, and pinpoint things very accurately with latitude and longitude. Of course, this is way before GPS, but that intrigued me. And
well, sounds like because you wanted to know more about the story of what was going on there.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, which brings us around to Mike then, because if what you had in those days were section corners and latitude and longitude and a map that was, who knows, 100 years old, 150 years old, maybe older, what Mike brings to the table is something infinitely more complex and varied. Tell us about that and why it is that GIS and history make such an interesting pairing.
Well, I think let me back up just a little bit, because I think what's interesting is Dave is actually a computer programmer by his training. So very analytical, and my undergraduate was not techie stuff, economics. I wanted to understand how the world worked. I got a master's in environmental policy. I wanted to influence what was going on, and I just kind of fell into GIS like we all kind of bounce around, we end up somewhere. And what I found is that I needed to find a way I could make a living in the rural America,
Well, clearly you're the only one that ever faced that problem.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But what I think is interesting there is that we both have a love of the outdoors, and obviously both into maps, and so we complement each other quite well, which is, I think, a big part of the success of our project together. But to get back to your question, it's a good time to be in the GIS world. Its ability now to handle big maps, big images, is much better than it was when it first got started. So I can scan huge maps and put them into the computer, reference them over the face of the earth, overlay them. And when you do that, you have access to so much more information than the historians of old have had. You find information that you couldn't see before because
stuff like what? What are you referring to? What are you putting at Dave's fingertips when you do that?
I'll dive in here.
Okay.
Yeah. Early on, once the GPS was available to the common man and not just the military, so I think that was in the 1990s, where you could have a handheld GPS and know exactly your latitude and longitude.
Mm-hmm. GPS stands for Global Positioning Systems. Okay.
Right. That was incredible to me. And all of a sudden I realized that I could translate an old map into actual physical location. So an example is I had a 1875 Atlas of Colorado done by the Hayden Survey. And it's very detailed. And it showed all these roads and some towns and that type of thing. And I was able to very painstakingly, before GIS really, or before I used GIS systems, hand trace those onto tracing paper, and then using an old drafting table, I translated each point along, say, a road to the actual latitude and longitude, entered that into a spreadsheet, uploaded that into a mapping program, and then all of a sudden I could go out into the field and download that into my GPS before I left. And then I'd go out into the field and I could say, 200 yards off this highway is an old road. And I'd walk 200 yards into the woods and I'd find this road. Never before could I have done that, because I could know that that old road was somewhere nearby, but GPS I could get right there.
You'd have gone through quite a few pairs of shoes trying to find
Correct.
it.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of it for me.
Well, and so that's even old school compared to what Mike's talking
Very
about.
old school.
And so, Mike, what else now? There's one layer, taking old maps and overlaying them using GPS on new ones. But now what do you have? I mean, there's layer upon layer of information. Give us an example of what kind of stuff that is.
Well, I guess what popped into my head was, when you read a journal of the Gunnison Journal when he came through, he's describing things, right? And you're reading it, and maybe you have the topo map in front of you, you have a modern road map, you have maybe the Hayden map that you've seen in the past. But what happens is when you can overlay a lot more maps with lots of different labels on them,
you're more likely to find something that's in his narrative. Is that the idea?
Right. I can give you some examples. So there's the Beale Journal. The Beale is an expedition that came right before the Gunnison expedition. And they talked about crossing in front of the Eagle Range Mountains. And nothing on the map says Eagle Range. But based on a whole lot of other maps and other journals and so forth, you piece it together. Now we know that Eagle Range is Sawtooth Mountain. And now we can say, okay, well, based on that, his trail went to the east of Sawtooth. We know where he went, and then we start putting other maps on the table, and you see on the topo map, geez, at some point there was a trail here and it petered out. And so you start making much better educated guesses on where this guy actually went.
And from a historian's point of view, why is that better than just simply knowing, okay, he came through here?
Well, if I could expand a little bit on Mike's story about the Eagle Range, I have known for years that on several old maps, the Gunnison River was called the Eagle Tail River.
Really?
Really.
Huh.
And, names change, but we had no idea why it was called the Eagle Tail River. But Mike came up with a theory, and I'd like him to explain that theory, which first I was a little bit
skeptical, perhaps?
Skeptical might be the word.
Okay.
But I'm a believer now.
So we're on the cutting edge of discovery here. Mike, go.
Yes, we could very easily be living in the town of Eagletail. There's several different pieces of information. The best piece, I think, is the Loring expedition in 1859, Dave? Somewhere about that.
58, I think.
Okay.
A while back. Let's
a while
put it that
back.
way.
He's a military guy, and he's keeping a good journal, and we know exactly when he turns off the Tamichi, he's heading back towards Taos from the west. Turns off the Tamichi right at Razor Creek, and he says, at that point, I'm heading up the Eagle Tail Valley. So bing, bing, what's going on there? Why would he call that the Eagle Tail? Then I found this map, 1851. It was created in Taos, and it lists who was the people that contributed to it, and most of those guys were fur trappers. And the map is called the North New Mexico Territories, and it looks like a map from Lord of the Rings. It has that look to it. And the top of the map, where it ends, is the range between the Gunnison Valley and the Rio Grande Valley. And it shows two little mountains that are labeled Peaks of the Eagle Tail, and then a creek going through those, and at the end of it, it says Eagle Tail Creek. And that's the end of the map. There's nothing else labeled on the other side of the divide. So to get on that map, they must have been a prominent feature. So then I'm looking around, and I'm not sure how I noticed this, but at some point on the topo map, there's a rock face up there that's now labeled as V Rock. And it is a cliff face that is probably 2,000 feet on each end, and it's shaped like a V or the tail of an eagle. and it's right up where the peaks of the Eagle Tail would be.
Which is right near Razor Creek Dome.
Yeah.
Okay. Which is near Coachtoe Park.
Correct.
Is near Coachtoe Park. And if I could interject here, Mike tells me this whole story, and I'm thinking, that's a stretch there, Mike.
Because V's look like a lot of things.
V's look like a lot of things and so forth. And he said, it's like when you're on foot or on horseback and you're an early traveler, you navigate by landmarks, right? And so maybe this was a landmark. It looks like an eagle tail, and that's if you're going east along the Tamichi Valley, you turn south at the Eagle Tail to go over Coachtoe Pass. I said, okay. So I was on a bike ride. Favorite bike ride is up Ohio Creek. Rode up there. It was a couple of years ago in the early spring. Rode back down, and I happened to look up when I was about halfway down the valley, and I'll be darned if that eagle tail didn't just pop out.
Miles and miles away.
Oh, yeah. I mean, what am I, 30, 40 air miles away?
Yeah.
And because the snow hits that rock, and there was no other snow around, and it was so prominent as a landmark. And we happened to know that Ohio Pass was an early Ute Indian trail, and maybe earlier Indian than that. And if you are at the top of the pass, and we've proven this, if you're at the top of the pass, you can see that from the top of Ohio Pass. And so it's a pretty good navigational aid. And that's when I was a believer.
So I think the listener can by now understand why I refer to you guys as map geeks. I mean, here you are. Some people, I don't know, they're into sports. Maybe you are also, but you see my point? How many people are digging through old archives and finding that map from 1851? This begs the question then, because that's an awesome story and a level of understanding of our place that a lot of people who live here never even approach. The history of what has gone on before. Why Is this something that you feel so passionate about, you spend your time chasing down little mysteries like this?
In general, I've always enjoyed researching history because it gives me a sense of place. That's not only where I live, but when I travel, I like to read a little bit about the history and pick up pamphlets and so forth because it just makes it more real to me if I understand a little bit about what came before.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason I'm so passionate about researching history is because it's like a puzzle. It's like solving a puzzle. And you find one little piece of information, and oftentimes that leads you to another thing and another thing. The story we just told is an example of that. And all of a sudden it's like, eureka, I solved this puzzle. And I mean, I think that's what turns my crank.
Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of people would say that's why they play video games, because they're laid out in very much the same way. The landscape in a video game is littered with clues, and you're putting it together to solve some mystery. So here you guys are. It's not digital, but nevertheless, there you are doing it.
Yeah, I've thought about that, and I've thought, maybe I should play some video games.
Yeah, or design them.
Right? But then I think, I'm having so much fun anyway.
Yeah. And, you're off the couch and out in the world.
That's right.
Mike, same question. What is it about this that makes you spend your time doing it?
Well, I think I'm a bit of a dreamer, but I like the thoughts that history helps develop the caretaking attitude for people of the land. And the way I see that happening is if you understand the history of an area, and by the way, history, like Dave was saying, is full of fascinating puzzles and mysteries, and people love that. And it's also full of very hard-earned lessons that we should not forget. I mean, if you have the knowledge, you have an appreciation, and I think appreciation leads to caretaking, and I think that's what we need more of in our world, is people wanting to caretake our environment, our land. I believe that humans, that is our role here, is to caretake the land.
Yeah, and you've said that your one of your degrees is in environmental studies. Do you find that this key that you've discovered of looking back as a way to look forward is something that's catching on? Or because a lot of environmental thought and discussion and philosophy is so forward-looking. It's all about what is coming if certain things don't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that this would be a way to broaden that conversation and really get us to look forward better by looking back?
I agree. When you look back, you have a better foundation for when you're looking forward. You have more credibility. And I believe that when you're talking to folks in the community, there is so much interest in the history. You capture their attention. They're not going to read a lot of what we like to write unless there's something that captures their attention. And history does that. It gives a leg in to have an audience when you have interesting history at the forefront of your discussion.
So if now I know about eagle tail, and when I look up there and I see that, I'm more likely to care what happens to that location. Is that the point?
I think that's part of the point, for sure. But also, every time now I drive east out of town and I go over a certain hill, I know that at that point the eagle tail will become visible, and it'll be visible for about 2.5 miles. And I look at it every single time. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's important because, I don't know, it's a landmark that I remember, and I remember the story behind it, and I think of, probably originally Native Americans, and then after that the Spanish, and then after that the fur trappers, and then after that the explorers. They all probably used that landmark, and that's important to me,
And why exactly? And here I'm asking this question in the context of daily life today, because we're in that chain. We're standing where all of those historical figures that you mentioned have stood. But here we are. We're doing what they had to do. We're trying to make a living. trying to get by, right? Trying to survive a winter, although this winter was, an
Easy.
exception. Why should I stop and care? Why should I spend time to educate myself about things like that? How does that make my life better? How does it make the community's life better?
I'll take a stab at that.
Okay.
One of my passions in the past 10 or so years has been a study of what's beneath Blue Mesa Reservoir. And I put together a slideshow of all historical shots starting at the Lake City Bridge and going to the dam. That's proven to be a extremely popular slideshow that I've shown probably hundreds of times. And I asked myself why. And I think, number one, it's because it's not there. I'm showing something that can never be seen again. And it's kind of like a mystery, right? But a lot of people that have seen my slideshow say that their trip to Montrose has been changed, completely. Because as they drive along the reservoir, they think about the town of Iola, they think about the fishing resorts, they think about the Sportsman's Lodge at Savoia.
They wonder where the bridges are.
They wonder where the bridges are. And here's my point. That makes them think more about, should we be building reservoirs? And what's the real impact of doing this? I mean, that reservoir was built in the early 60s, before a lot of us were here. And so it's just a thing. But
yeah, it's just where we boat and picnic and swim in the summer.
It's a good thing. But it was a totally different thing before 1960. It was supposed to be probably the best fly fishing in the world. And so I think that, knowing something about, in that case, the history of building that dam and what it covered up and what it was replaced with makes people think a little bit about the balance. I mean, you got hydroelectric power, that's a good thing. You got water storage, that's a good thing. You don't have any fly fishing, that's a bad thing.
Yeah, it's trade-offs.
It's a trade-off.
Well, something like Mount Vesuvius erupting and burying Pompeii, that was an act of nature, right? But this wasn't. This was an act of politics, and it took a decision. And so if I understand you, you're suggesting that knowing about that helps inform the next decision that you have to make.
I think so. And another little example, when we started to mine here in the Gunnison country in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, we built towns wherever we felt there was a good reason to build a town, nearby mines, okay? And there was a town called Woodstock on the railroad grade to the Alpine Tunnel. And they built a little town there, but it was in an avalanche path. They didn't even think about it. And one day an avalanche came down and killed 13 people. Knowing that, you're never going to build a town there again. But more than that, every time you think about building even a structure, you now think about avalanches because you know that avalanches cause death.
ThinkRadio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper. ThinkRadio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can join the ThinkRadio community of patrons, visit alanwartismedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
And this is a good example of the kind of thing that GIS allows us to do. Because with the click of a button, you could overlay a historical map of avalanches on the piece of property that you're considering buying and putting your cabin on. I mean, is that possible? That's an example of what...
Yeah, and that gets used all the time. I mean, our mapping is very useful for buying and selling decisions, I mean, not just finding places, but information like wildfire and geologic hazards and things like that.
But you guys have set out to try and bring all of that kind of information that you normally are looking at when you're trying to buy a piece of property or develop something with historical information like this is where the old Spanish road was. Why do you think it's important that those two things come together? All of the sort of technical stuff about floodplains and so forth and, substrata and geological types and all of that stuff with a bit of information about what has happened here before.
It's that people want to be connected, right? People want to be connected with their phones to other people, but I think they also want to be connected to the land and to whatever interests them. And so what we're doing is providing one little access point to a little bit more connection to knowing that place, that area. It ties them to it. And, with the Old Spanish Trail, we have good reason to believe there's a section of it that is just to the west of town that is not disturbed, relatively undisturbed, on the north side of the Gunnison Canyon. There's a parking lot right there along Beaver Creek, and we could put some signs up that say, hey, did you realize that you're going to enjoy a nice walk along this creek bottom, but you could also take a left right and you could be on what we think to be the Old Spanish Trail, and here are reasons why, and it's a mystery. We don't know all the answers. What do you think? Because it makes it more interesting that way.
It certainly does. I mean, I remember as a teenager, I visited Europe for the first time. And day one, took a little walking tour of the old section of Geneva. And the tour guide said, okay, now stop, and I want you to be quiet and listen, because you're standing at a Roman crossroads. And I want you to imagine Roman legions marching north and coming back home and that sort of thing. It completely transformed my experience. It went from being here we are in the city, to what? Wow. And so are you getting that sort of feedback from people with the information that you're putting out there, that how it's transforming their experience?
I think so. I mean, an example, we also know that the Gunnison expedition with their wagons, first wagons in the Gunnison country in about 1853, went south of the Gunnison River Canyon. None of them went through the Gunnison River Canyon where Highway 50 goes today. And so what I think is interesting is that why not? Well, you go through there at 50 miles an hour, you don't even think about it. But next time you go through there, think about how many cliffs have been cut to allow the road to basically be on one side of the river. If you look at old maps, that river went from side to side 4 times. That means if you're on foot, you have to ford the river 4 times in about a 6-mile section. And if you're willing to get wet, great, but you probably weren't. So nobody walked through the Gunnison River Canyon. They all walked to the north or to the south. Mm-hmm. And that isn't maybe as interesting as the Roman legions, but
no.
But it's also interesting in thinking about how people got from point A to point B. I mean, another thing, a friend of mine, his great-grandmother homesteaded out there at Iola, and in her memoirs that she wrote in about 1925 of homesteading there in the 1870s, she said to get to Gunnison from Iola, you had to go up Willow Creek to Pole Creek, and then around the south side of Big Mesa, and then basically down into the backside of Hartman Rocks and on to Gunnison. It was a 2-day trip. And to me, that's really interesting.
2 days from Iola to Gunnison.
Correct. And now, today, what is that, 15 minutes?
At most,
yeah.
Depending on who's driving.
Right.
Wow, yeah. So these are the kinds of tidbits that you're talking about, but they make a huge difference. And so let's shift then to this project that you've created, because you set out to pull a lot of this together in a place that is accessible, and created 4 maps. And I'd love to have you describe them to us and then tell us how we can see them.
I'll let Mike describe the maps, but first let me just describe the project in general.
Okay.
The project in general is Mike and I at this time had known each other for a long time and had talked about mapping Gunnison country history, but we hadn't done it. Finally, we were able to get time to do it, and I said, well, I could do the historical research and Mike can do the mapping, and we worked very closely together. And one thing that I don't think Mike mentioned about a GIS system is it's a great mapping system, but underlying the map is a database of any data you want to have. So that for every point or road or anything we mapped, you can click on it within the GIS system and pull up data that I did research on. And I also put like bibliographic entries in there, so if somebody sees that, they could research it more. But anyway, that was the concept. What I would do the kind of the historical research, Mike would do the mapping, and obviously we both did both as the project progressed. And it's all in one system, but then we produced 4 maps. And Mike, why don't you tell them what those 4 maps are?
Yeah, so originally the intent was to just have a database of this information. And my boss was like, hey, you got to tell the story. The story is the interesting part of this. And so we set out and decided to break it into 4 maps. They all have the same extent. They are the Gunnison Country, which is Gunnison County, plus everything that kind of flows into the county. So that would include Lake City area. But the extent goes from Silverton, Leadville, San Luis Valley, Grand Mesa. So you had to round out the corners there on a map, right? So that's why those areas are on. The time periods are basically, the first one is prior to 1860, and that's some geology, some fur trapping, Spanish, vegetation, and then the earliest explorers that came through.
And some Native American
Yes,
also.
certainly. I'm sorry. I absolutely, lots of Native American stuff. The second map was 1861 to 1878, and that time period is early placer mining. So folks were coming into the area, finding gold and other stuff in the creeks, but not really digging into the hillside, because the infrastructure wasn't there to do that. And during that time period, there's a lot of interaction with the Utes, not friendly interaction. So interesting stories that occurred then.
And let's be clear, when you're looking at these maps, and they're large format maps, right? They're big.
Well, they're 3 feet by 2.5.
And a lot of these stories are actually on the map. So it's not just that you're
Right.
looking at the terrain, and I find it interesting too that it's not just a number on the map and then you go to some legend and look up the story. It's on the map, so your eyes are scanning and you're seeing, okay, here's where this happened and that. That was a really interesting idea. How'd you come upon that idea of putting the information straight on the map like that?
I think it came from reading lots of National Geographic magazines over the year.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't usually put that much information on the map, but I think there was such good stories to tell that they needed to be on there, and we just took a crack at a format, and it seemed to work.
Yeah.
I'd
Go
like
ahead.
to just interject there that, we found all these old maps, and we transcribed or transferred the trails and the towns and so forth to the map, but along the way we found all these journals and old documents that told us these stories, and we would sometimes sit there and just laugh at some of the stories of these. And that's where the stories came out to us. We said, this is cool that there was a town here and there was a road here and a railroad here, but what's really neat is this story we found about X, right?
Well, because maps aren't that interesting if all they're talking about are landscape features. They're more interesting when they tell us the human story, because that's our story.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the next map in the series?
So the next map is the boom and bust. The Utes were kicked out of the area. The miners came roaring in. Dwayne Vandenbush estimated 25,000 people at its peak. And it lasted about 4 years, and then it kapoofed.
The time it takes to get through Western is how long the boom and bust lasted in the Gunnison County. Wow.
And then the last map is everything after the bust. So it gets into how the economy stabilized into mining, mostly coal mining, ranching, tourism, and then the college had a big impact when it came. And, since the 60s, with the creation of the ski resort and the Blue Mesa Reservoir, tourism has just been dominating, and especially in the form of second homes. And that's an interesting distinction.
Well, that's a different kind of boom and bust, for one thing. We're still kind of riding that boom and bust trail.
That's right.
Just a
That's
different
right.
commodity, right?
That's exactly right.
And that's interesting for people to know also, because when you're going through one of the bust cycles, it can feel like this has never happened before. It's never been this bad. It's never going to be this bad again. But a historical perspective helps sort of even those peaks and valleys out, at least in your mind.
It can also show that this place does have the ability to boom. We had 25,000 people come in a very, very short period of time.
We can boom, we can bust, we can boom again, we can survive. And so where can the public access these maps?
Well, they're online at GunnisonCounty.org, and if you go from there to the Historic Preservation Commission website, there's a mapping section. You can come to my office, and they're sold for $9 each. They're also at the libraries. They're in the Blackstock building, the courthouse. They're in the public schools. So I've been giving them out to folks that will display them.
And if you go to see one of these maps, plan on spending an hour, because you're going to get completely drawn into the story.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking of the story, I want to give you an opportunity, with all the research you did, all the journals you read, all those times you said you spent laughing at what has gone before. Give us a couple of examples. What were you finding that was so fascinating to you?
All right. One of my favorites was from the Beale expedition, which was one of 3 expeditions in 1853. And as all those expeditions did, they came over Cochetope Pass, which is today's North Pass, the same pass that the highway goes over. And Beale's journal noted that they passed by a remarkable cliff which beetled over the trail. And we thought, that's pretty odd. What's that mean?
Yeah.
And I Googled it, and it turns out the word beetling over or beetled over is kind of a antiquated term popular in the 1800s to talk about anything that kind of hangs over. If you think about a beetle up on its forelegs and its head is kind of hanging over, I think that's where the term comes from.
I doubt I would ever have come to that myself, but I'll take your word for it.
Well, that's
Okay.
what we found, and we thought we kind of liked that. In the journal was a drawing of this very prominent rock that kind of beetled over the trail because it had an overhang over the trail. And then a little bit later in 1853, John Fremont came through, and actually he had a photographer along, first time ever taking daguerreotype photographs in the wild, and he took a picture of it, which ended up as an engraving that we have also, same rock. And so Mike and I thought, we got to go find this thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we knew approximately where it was, but not quite. And so we took a hike kind of from the east side of the base of Cochetope Pass up the valley where we knew the road was. Today the current road is kind of on the hillside, but the old road went right up the valley. And we walked up that valley, and we walked up, I don't know what I think, about 2 miles or something like that, come around a corner, and there was that rock, just as it was in the pictures.
Beetling away.
Beetling away. And that was just really fun for us to discover this rock. And clearly we were right on the old road that they were going over, which we also is pretty well documented to be part of the old Spanish Trail.
And so you could stand there for a minute under this beetling rock and think about all that had passed that way.
And more than that, it's another one of those landmarks. It's like you're traveling, you're separated, go on ahead, meet me at the rock that beetles over the trail, right? So our theory is there was lots and lots of camping there.
Yeah.
And so there was a tremendous amount of human activity at that place because it was a landmark. Today, you could walk right by it and not even think anything of it.
Mm-hmm.
But
Most people do. You may be
Right.
the only two alive until now who knew that rock was anything to anyone.
that was really fun.
And so are you also archaeology geeks? Would you be tempted to go back out there with a trowel and see what you could find?
Yeah, I've done that.
Yeah.
And it is fun to find things. I have located potential camps and so forth, and found evidence of human occupation.
And so what are the ethics involved with that? If people go out and, they start, as a result of your maps and your passion, they go, wow, we got to go find stuff ourselves. What would you advise them to do when they come across things that are clearly of a historic nature?
Well, my advice is leave it where you found it. I mean, I photograph things, and nowadays with a smartphone camera, it automatically stamps it with the latitude and longitude, so that you have a record.
They
But-
couldn't do that with a Garrotype.
No, you can't do that. I don't think. And then leave the thing for someone else. And I don't mean for someone else to take, but someone else to do interpretation. Because when you take it out of context, that artifact no longer means anything to anybody. And so I feel pretty strongly about that.
So with GIS technology coming on the way it is, what is the future of historical research and interpretation and education, for that matter? What do you see coming down the road?
Nobody's going to be able to do it any better than what we're doing, right, Dave?
No. No, I really think a lot about historical tourism. And some people are really into that. My theory is that some people, a family, some people want to go skiing, fishing, hunting, and some other people in the family don't. So what do? And I think they might be really interested in history. I really like the idea of easily consumable history on a smart device that is driven by GPS, so that as you drive along, hopefully you're not driving while you're doing this, but it'll show you, okay, at this point, here is a picture from 1920, and this is what it looked like in 1920, and a little bit of text, maybe even audio, that describes the place, and then you go to the next place. That's one idea.
It's a virtual museum tour.
Right, and those exist. I mean, if you go to a place like San Francisco,
Sure.
they definitely have those, but to do it on a larger scale, so drive Highway 50 and use this app, right? That's one thing. And the other thing that kind of interests me is like virtual reality. I mean, I think we're just on the cusp of putting on some glasses, which a lot of people have done, and you can see these 3D movies and look around and stuff like that. I think that could be adapted to a mixture of what's there now and historical images that would be really slick.
So you could walk down Main Street, Gunnison, and see it in its
Bumping
pioneer
into
days.
people as you go.
Yeah. Hopefully staying out of the street.
Right, out of the street be key.
Yeah.
That's
So
a great example. Yeah, that will be really nice. And there's a lot of power in taking it, just a simple photograph of an old building, and putting that in a modern photograph, cutting the image so that you see the old amongst the new. That's powerful. And what you're talking about is leaps forward above that.
So what are you personally working on now? You got a new project, expanding the project that is already underway, or what's going on?
Well, Mike and I, we can't stay out of this thing. I mean, we wanted to declare it finished, but it's never finished.
You know,
right?
I'm not sure I buy that. I think you didn't want to get out of it.
Well, that's true. In fact, I was over at his office picking him up today, and he says, "Look at this! I've got this. I think we need to revisit this." And I said, "Well, I think we should go do this interview." But that happens all the time, and it really provides a lot of enjoyment.
Yeah. So, Mike, what stands out in your mind from the process of creating these maps? What did you learn?
Well, lots of interesting things. And, in my job, I'm trying to help the decision makers make better decisions with mapping information, all kinds of information. One of the things that we learned from doing this work, looking at the journals of the folks that came through in 1853, now that's prior to the valley being developed by white man, so just the Utes were here at that time. What they described in their journal was largely seeing luxurious grass. That was their phrase, luxurious grass, in areas today where there is sagebrush. They did describe sagebrush in certain areas. So we don't think that they were just trying to describe it in the best possible light to say this, everybody should come our way. I think they were being fairly honest. And so I think what that means at that time, the landscape was being managed by the Utes, and they were managing it for creating game that they wanted to hunt: elk, buffalo, pronghorn, those sorts of things. And so they would burn the sage to create more grass. And in the sage grouse issue that we're having today, there's, if you look at the Federal Register of their decision to list the bird, they go back and say back in the 1880s, all this irrigation came in and took out lots of sagebrush. And they're saying that we've lost sagebrush with the whites coming. Well, I think it's just the opposite. They didn't go back far enough in time prior to the whites coming. And so one of the pieces of evidence for that grass, not just the journals, but daguerreotype photos that were taken by the Fremont expedition at Dillon Pinnacles, it clearly shows wavy grass in the foreground, where today it is all sagebrush.
Well, you've hit upon something that is extremely important. If you follow the debates over listing endangered species of any kind, historical range of habitat is enormously important. That's an item that they fight over. And you're suggesting that maybe they don't have all the information?
Yeah, it could be that there was less sage grouse of the Gunnison sage grouse here at the time. We just don't know. It's still debated what the sage grouse needs. You know, it begs the question, after whites came in, did more Gunnison sage grouse move in or less?
Or are they less dependent on today's sage grouse habitat than they were historically? I mean, that's one possibility. Well, that's an awesome example of how we've been talking about the quest for greater historical understanding as kind of a hobby, kind of entertainment in a way, education, but with a education light almost for most people. But you've just given us an example of how it can have real world relevance on very large issues to just understand the past better. I love it.
No, that's what it's all about. We mentioned the Beale expedition in 1853, and it has a wonderful journal. And of course, the quality of the journal depends on who's writing it, right? And whoever was writing that journal for the Beale expedition was out of this world. Well, the Beale expedition was led by the superintendent of Indian Affairs for the state of California. And actually, he was traveling from the Mississippi River back to California looking for places for good Indian reservations. Think about that. 1848, gold rush, California. They needed to displace the Native Americans. Anyway, they had more of a bias toward looking at Native Americans and describing them. And so there's these great descriptions of Native American encounters that they had. And just the entire journal, we've thought, this could make a movie. It's that good, right? And so one of the things Mike and I have talked about is working on some sort of app or a website or something that allowed people to relive that expedition and follow it through Colorado. And so that's one of the projects that we've been talking about a long time and haven't made a lot of progress toward, but hope to.
Well, when you do begin making progress on that, come back and we'll talk more about your documentary film, virtual reality tour of Colorado. Thanks for the conversation, guys. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yeah, it's been wonderful.
ThinkRadio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper.
Think Radio is a production of Alan Wardis Media. The show's executive producer is Issa Forrest. Associate producer, Kat Seibert. Original music by Issa Forrest. New episodes are available for download every Monday morning on iTunes and at alanwardismedia.com. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Think Radio.